Good morning. Okay, let's get the show on the road. How are you folks this morning? How was traffic to get here? Pretty good? Whoever took the train, subway is better than the cars, right? This is our third year we do this event, and for those who've been here for 3 years, you remember 3 years ago we had about 75 people in the room, and it's been a journey of Red Hat growth and phenomenal growth over the last 3 years. And some of you must have seen the result of our Q1 result yesterday was announced by Jim Whitehurst, our CEO, and we had another stellar performance in Q1 with 19% growth. And for those who have enjoyed to be a shareholder of Red Hat, our stock went up by 10% yesterday only. So, yeah, he's a shareholder, someone here. We've had 61 quarter of growth in a row. That's 15 years plus 1 quarter. Quite phenomenal growth that we've had. And someone applause? Cool. And I'm told it's all because of Canada, so good. Since we were here last year, it's about 12 months since we did this event. We've made 3 acquisitions. One was right at the time where the Q1 result last year came about, which is about this time of the year, we made an announcement at the same time that we acquired Ansible. And I know a lot of you guys are using Ansible. Raise your hand how many of you are using Ansible. Look at that, 20% of the room. And how many of you are using Ansible Tower? Okay, cool. So this acquisition was probably one of the most successful acquisitions we've made from a growth of the business perspective over the last several years. Then we acquired a TreeScale about 6 months ago, an API management tool for you to be able to manage your API in a better way. So that's also something we've seen our customer be very interested about. And recently, Code Envy, another acquisition we've made to help you to manage your container. There's a lot of container discussion, as you know, and everywhere. And we felt like customer needs a way to be able to manage those better. That's going to help you out to enable you to be more efficient, how to manage your container business. My name is Luc Villeneuve. I'm the country manager for Red Hat Canada. I'll be here for you for the kickoff. Then I have to run to another important appointment I have in Kitchener, and I'll be leaving it to Claude Reeve. Claude is there in the back. He's my sales director for Canada. He's going to be hosting the event for the rest of the day. In Canada, we did some phenomenal things in the last 12 months. We added 35% more people in Canada in 1 year. So the growth of Canada has been phenomenal. It's not only salespeople, but it's support, solution architect, mostly sales specialists, professional services people to help you to deliver the solution that are coming to you. And some of you don't have a lot of skill set, so we have a big increase in our professional services business to allow you to enable you to get a quick start on some of the technology that you are deploying. We're going to hear today, we have a great agenda, by the way. For the first time, we're going to have a Mike Burchell coming from the UK. It's funny, I reached out to Mike. It was a little funny story, Mike, right? And first, I said it in Montreal. I don't think you caught the story. We kind of debriefed on at the airport yesterday, and we found that out. I took a picture of a slide that had Mike's name on it. He's the chief security architect. I took a picture and thinking it was him presenting on the stage, right? Because I missed the introduction. So then I sent him an email inviting him to Montreal and Toronto for speaking, and then I saw him in Montreal and said, this isn't the same guy that I saw on the stage. So it turned out someone was using his slides, and now he's here. So Mike did a great job in Montreal, which is going to be a great job. He's our last speaker today at the end of the day, just before our CTO, Mike Carthy. But Mike does a great job on security. I know this is the first time we bring security topic in one of our events. I thought it was very, very important to bring security at this time because there's so many new solutions, and I think I wanted Mike to be able to bridge the gap, the security gap, on how Ansible fits and how TreeScale and all these OpenShift, the container, how we secure container, and Mike will do a great job for you to help you in your organization to assess the security element around that. We're going to also have another Mike is going to talk about our innovation lab. He's going to do a live demo innovation lab, things that are quite remarkable. And to me, we're going to see Dave Sefs from IDC presenting the first speaker. He's going to talk about all kind of data point and all kind of stats showing the gap between where we are from a skill set perspective, where the organization are somewhat behind in digital transformation and innovation. And what you're going to realize with the Innovation Lab is our solution to help you to bridge the gap of that skill gap. And pay attention to that. That's something that a lot of our customers are now using and trying to accelerate the deployment of net new solution by using Innovation Lab approach, which is a great way to execute on that front. Another little note here, for the first time this year at Summit, how many people were at Summit in Boston this year? Okay, not enough. We had about 175 customers from Canada at Summit, and it was up by about 120 from the year before. Next year it's in San Francisco in May. Usually it's in May, so start to plan your time, your vacation, bring your husband or wife, go spend a little weekend in San Francisco and attend Summit next year. It's a great event. There's about 1,200 different breakout session, workshop, and it's people learn a lot. And last year, for the first time, we had a Canadian customer on the big stage with our CEO, Jim Whitehurst. BC government went on the stage to talk about OpenShift and what they were able to do on, you can look at YouTube, BC government OpenShift, and you're going to find out a 12-minute video on their acknowledgement of what they've done from a government perspective. This is quite remarkable. And to be on the stage. And next year, I'm told there will be some more Canadian customers on the stage, so we're looking for volunteers to raise your hand so we can nominate you for San Francisco next year. I wanted to talk about a little bit about an announcement that a lot of customers don't know that RHEL 5 is end of life. And it's been end of life since April 1st. What that means, you have 2 years to migrate to 6 or 7 or whatever you want to do. And certainly it's an opportunity for you to look at transforming your business and to potentially move some of that old workload and potentially in the cloud. So for those of you that have not did a full assessment of where you are with the version of Linux, which is, we have about 4,000 customers in Canada running Linux. So I suspect some of you have, and some of you still have RHEL 5, and be careful about it. It's end of life. You would have seen a note from Red Hat potentially over the last few days. There was a breach of security on RHEL 5. So if you don't have support, you should look at it very carefully because we're here to support you, and if you don't have support contract, it could be an issue. So having said that, I will invite David Senf, my buddy David Senf. He's been with me for 3 years. Every city, everywhere we go, we kind of hang together, hey David? And he's done a great job. I mean, one thing this year that David is going to share with you that is a little departure from the year before is sharing the things that the ADC discovered and we're talking about 2 or 3 years ago. Now it's become a reality. And it's very, very interesting when I was listening to him in Montreal. The gap is actually getting wider in some of the areas. So David's going to share all that with you. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Luke.
Appreciate
it. Appreciate the invite again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ooh, do I get another red hat? Or do I have to give these out? Oh, okay. I thought I get to keep it. No, apparently not. All right. So good morning, everyone. Good morning. One more time. Good morning, everyone. All right. Now the caffeine's kicking in. Good. So when I was here back 3 years ago, when Red Hat started, and as Luke mentioned, there was a much smaller room that we were all in. And we were talking at that point about, what some of the challenges were in our market and where organizations were struggling, and there definitely has been some pretty big changes. Do you remember how we were talking about how interesting, the shared economy is, and we were talking about how, look what the third platform can do for you, cloud plus mobility plus big data plus social, et cetera. And we were talking all about, Uber and Airbnb and all those, different types of companies. Last year in Toronto, so Airbnb at that time was just a concept. It was an idea. We all thought, oh, cool, I can book hotel rooms online, and shouldn't Marriott be worried about this? Now, fast forward to last year, and in Toronto alone, I don't know if you saw an article that just came out talking about 450,000 room nights booked in Toronto alone on Airbnb. 450,000 to the tune of $400 million of opportunity there. So, when we think about just how quickly things are changing, we can see it in the numbers. I know that, I happen to be an Uber taker, whichever way you think on that, but, versus what's happening in our traditional industries, it's just easier. It's we see Amazon buying Whole Foods and becoming not just an entrant into the grocery business, but certainly an entry into a supplier of food to restaurants, a supplier of food to universities, or you name it. Right? So they're fundamentally changing business models, and how can they do it? Because they're on a different architecture, a vastly different architecture than we've seen before. But guess what? We all get to use that architecture if we start to do things differently internally, and if we adopt the tools that folk like Red Hat are talking about in terms of OpenShift and in terms of Ansible, et cetera, helps us be able to do the things that we need to do in order to be able to capitalize on platform as a service, on infrastructure as a service. So, it's funny when we think about the amount of change that's out there, it just doesn't slow down, does it? And we're now calling this thing the fourth industrial revolution that we're in. And it does feel like that, doesn't it? Like the amount of new things that we have to seem to learn on a daily basis. And the really interesting conversations that I'm having with a number of you on a daily basis, just about, how are you using DevOps? How is that changing your attack surface? How is that changing what you need to do from a security perspective? What's your new architecture look like? And so what we're doing is, at IDC, is we're looking at the more successful Canadian organizations, those with higher revenue growth, those who are able to achieve the goals that they want from end user satisfaction, et cetera, and comparing those against organizations who aren't doing so well, right? Or just aren't doing quite as well as they would like to be doing. And so what we do is learn from the successful organizations versus those who aren't successful, so those who can adapt to change. So back when, in the before time, 3 years ago, when we were at this event and we were chatting, we talked about this complexity gap that IT in Canada is dealing with. And the line of business is saying, my gosh, yes, I see that you have a complexity gap. And the IT department is saying, oh my God, we have a complexity gap. We'd love to be able to do some of these cool new things, but we're challenged to be able to do it because of this gap that we're facing. So I said, well, here's what some successful companies are doing. They're investing in tools like Ansible and Chef and Puppet and Vagrant and all the different kind of tools that are available to them, both the closed source and the open source tools that can help them automate their configuration, patching, updating, all the different stuff that they need to do. And that they're adopting processes like change management and portfolio management. And I said, well, you don't want to just do it because you can reduce this thing called complexity and make people feel good. You want to do it because it makes you more money, or it helps you reduce your application deployment time, which at the time, by the way, was 7 months. So it took us 7 months to say, oh, I've got this great idea. I want to create this cool new application so my customers get to do cool new stuff with my organization. And then from that point to launching that was about 7 months at the time. Well, guess what we're down to now? 6 months. So anyway, we've got a ways to go there. But so what's happening is that organizations are seeing success by doing these things. It's not just about some feel-good reason, but again, I want to adopt these tools because it makes me better. I get all those benefits that are down on that side there. Even revenue growth, and how is revenue growth associated with adopting an automation tool or adopting better change management practices and ITIL change management, not HR change management. Because when the line of business or when, in IT we say, oh, we want to launch this new project, you can actually go ahead and do that because I've got the time and the ability to actually make that happen. And I can scale more quickly and do that with less risk and what have you. And then we said, okay, well, then you look at the hybrid cloud because it's the thing. You're going to expand what you're doing from a legacy perspective into the cloud. You want to do that from a maturity approach. We want to go from manual to automated. And of course, we want to invite what we can from the third platform into our organization. So that's what we were saying, 3 years ago, and a lot of that still holds true today, but now we're just adding a lot more on top of it, right? So it's hard to keep up, but let's do it. Let's go through and see what's happening in Canada. So we've got 4 kind of personalities of companies that have formed in Canada. We've got our traditionalists, our experimentalists, our operationalists, and our strategists. So our traditionalists, they're kind of wedded to the old way of doing things. They want to be able to keep the legacy systems, keep the legacy skills that they have. It's not that they necessarily don't want to progress. It's because either customers aren't demanding it quickly enough. They don't have the leadership of the organization that's helping create the culture that they need in order to be able to do things differently, or they're not getting the investment that they need in order to be able to do things differently. So there's a number of reasons why companies wind up being traditionalists. What we want to do is make traditionalists into experimentalists. Just start to try things out. An individual within a company starting to use platform as a service and starting to find out, okay, well, what can this new machine learning, if I use this in Azure or AWS or in Software or Bluemix or what have you, what can that do for me? Or if I'm just starting to look at what might this microservice architecture look like? If we were to take this application, not that we're actually going to do it as an organization, but look at this monolithic application and just consider what would the components be, and then how would I divide up those components, and what would I do from an identity standpoint? Would I be doing something, using OAuth or what have you, or how would I bring all those pieces together? And just starting to experiment and think about it and use these different types of solutions. And then we've got our operationalists that are starting to embed these ideas from a DevOps perspective, from a PaaS and microservice perspective, but also in terms of digital transformation. They're really, as an organization, starting to say, okay, I've got all these employee tasks within my organization that I could possibly automate. I've got all this customer engagement I'd love to be able to do with my customers, like find out why they left my brand and went over to this other brand over here and kind of discover what those things look like, but also engage them in new and different ways. Maybe it's setting up a mobile app for them to be able to use. And then the strategists, which we've got some in Canada. We've got some like HBC who's saying, I want to take on Amazon. We're going to start our own online retail outfit, which is just impressive. So when we think about what's happening, though, is we've kind of got 2/3 of our market on one side of this, and we've got 1/3 on the other side. And that's kind of being generous. I took all the organizations I could to find to move over to the right side of that chart. So it's a very liberal interpretation of the split of our market. One could argue it's almost an 80-20 split. But so what we want to do is try and get across that digital divide, right? So what I want to talk about today is how do we start to get across that digital divide? What are the things we want to start to do as organizations in order to be able to get across that and start to change these numbers? And there's really simple things. We all saw Moneyball, and that was a fun movie, and we saw Moneyball playing itself out with the Canadian women, Under Harmon taking on the World Championship in curling and using data in order to be able to do that and winning the World Championship. Yay for them, that was awesome. But it was just doing something very simple by analyzing shots and improving their ability to make good shots by about 17% and across the tournament. Of course, that makes a pretty big difference. Or you have companies like this that are kind of a strategist, right? They're out of Montreal, and they're reshaping the music industry in fundamental ways, and they're saying, here's this thing, this part of the process that would happen where we'd master a track and kind of give it its glossy sound, if you will, right? And it's expensive engineers that you hire to go ahead and do that, and a lot of bands just wouldn't be able to afford that. But what these guys out of Montreal did is they said, well, we can automate that. We can train our algorithms to listen to the songs that are on the top of the Billboard Hot 100, and then we can have our algorithm tune your song, so if you upload it to their website for $4.99, they'll make your song sound a little bit more like the songs on the top of the chart. And again, they're doing it using cloud, plus machine learning, plus there's a social dynamic to that as well, but predominantly it's really about cloud plus machine learning. And so what they're doing is creating a whole new market. And with the simple concept of how do we automate what a mastering engineer does, opens up this entire new market for them. You've got bands out of the other side of the globe using this service from this small Canadian company out of Montreal. Or another really simplistic example, all this company OTG is doing is dropping iPads into airports with menus on them in a billing system and saying, here, go order food, and guess what it does for me? I get to get to my gate and I can order my meal really quickly, and I don't have to wait for the waiter or waitress and go, are they going to show up in time? Am I going to miss my flight? And then I get to also swipe and bill myself, and I get to do that whenever I want. And oh, by the way, they wind up selling me more stuff because a pretty picture, I'm like, oh, cool, I want one of those sandwiches, I want one of those, and one of those. Anyway, so it was just fun. I just kept ordering things, and then, of course, who cares? You're paying with numbers in the background that you never think about anyway off a credit card. So they make more money in the end, but it also, basically, the point is that they reduce the friction of interacting and buying something while you're waiting for a flight. With a very simplistic idea. On the back end, though, they're collecting a whole bunch of data. There's a company out of Toronto doing a very similar type of thing, and what they're able to do is analyze that data, and they're becoming somewhat of a fintech company now. So they take a very simple idea of just kind of reducing the demand for the wait staff or making a restaurant more efficient, and then taking that data and doing something really advanced with it. So from a simple idea, again, being an experimentalist, you then can become an operationalist by starting with that simple idea and kind of building on top of that. So when we compare the organizations on the right side to the left side, the traditional folk and the experimentalists for the operational strategist, and we measure them. They're doing some really simple things, and then we'll kind of keep drilling into each one of these areas, but they're heavily invested in saying that technology is a great thing for our organization. It's the IT department, but it's also all of us. Our whole organization is invested in technology. They really like data. They're heavily invested in data, and they want to make sure they're getting the most out of it. They're analyzing it. Cloud is a really big thing, and it's not just about software as a service for them. It's about expanding into platform infrastructure as a service. It can also be about doing that on-prem and having the visibility across the different cloud environments, whether it's on-prem, whether it's in the cloud, or across the different types of cloud environments. So for them, hybrid cloud is this real thing. They're also all about the relationship that they have with their vendors. I thought this was really interesting. So we measure relationships, and we measure a bunch of different categories on what do you think of your vendors. And the relationships were much better across the board, and it strikes me as quite interesting. So you think that they're having these interesting conversations with the folk who are dealing with, problems that are greater than some of our problems might be. They're dealing with Wall Street or DoD or what have you, and able to communicate that back. I think it's funny. So you chat with the Red Hat folk, and just I call them up and say, hey, I want to talk about microservices, or I want to talk about this, and instantly you'll have a good conversation with these folks. So again, I think it's about having that relationship with vendors, whether it's Red Hat or any of your other vendors, but it's using them as an extension of your organization as much as possible. So when we look at the fact that we've got our traditionalists, we've got our experimentalists, but then we've got the other side across the divide. Most organizations want to be able to do something and do it differently from a DX standpoint, right? Whether it's being able to interact with customers differently, whether it's something simple like chatbots, or whether it's analyzing the data about my customers and doing that differently, or whether it's thinking about the tasks that all my different employees have in sales and marketing, HR and finance and what have you, and being able to automate that. Because it's not just about automating what IT does. I don't want to just sound like I'm picking on IT, saying IT should be using these tools. It's across the entire business. Right? And what's happening is that organizations aren't then reducing their headcount. So only about 10% of Canadian organizations, when they start to do further automation, actually go ahead and reduce that headcount. Most organizations actually either redeploy, because they say, well, you're more productive now, I can get you to do other tasks as well. And that's just a part and parcel of what we all do. Right? We may have had office managers and receptionists and all the different things that we all had back in the past, which are all pretty much gone from all of our organizations. And so you book your own travel, you do all the different things that you need to do that just don't exist. But it's just part and parcel of what we do. In the same way that part and parcel of what developers do or what infrastructure managers do is changing as well. And so there's more things that we will do, but that's across the whole organization. I don't like this chart. I created it, but I don't like it. And so it's one of those, it's also don't shoot the messenger type of things. So when we're looking at what's happening between the line of business versus IT, the gap isn't narrowing, the gap was widening. And so we see the IT department saying, yes, I want to be able to adapt and to change, and I want to be able to be more secure and help secure all this new stuff. Then we have the line of business saying, yeah, just give me the performance, give me the uptime, and I'll go find some of those things. I'll see what I can do about that. So I think there's opportunities to be able to narrow that gap, and I think the line of business isn't quite understanding all of the different things that IT does in terms of, do they know what identity management is? Do they know how to, what shared responsibility of security is and who has responsibility for what, et cetera? Well, of course not. So they need IT, and they need IT to be able to help work through the governance aspects of it and ultimately to manage all this and to be that partner that helps identify what parts of the business digital transformation is most important for. And then step 2 is what's the technology that's going to help get them there. And then step 3 is to actually project management or maybe product manage it, depending on your point of view. And so those 3 steps really help us get there. But I think it's about narrowing that gap between the line of business and IT as we just see that increasing a little bit. Okay, so why is that happening? Well, we still have this issue of 45% of organizations saying that I'm behind the curve, I want to be doing more from reducing my time on some of the basics that I have to do from just maintaining uptime and refreshing accounts or password resets and all the different things that I have to do. So I want to reduce that time. Again, we are down to about 6 months now from 7 months, but that's months and not days. And of course, from a continuous integration, continuous development process, we're looking at things now in terms of hours and days and not in terms of months. So we obviously need to keep bringing that number down as much as we can. So we'll talk about that as well. So it's not that all things are bad. I mean, we're doing a lot of the right things as a country. We're starting to move in the right direction in many different respects. As I said, there's more more companies becoming strategists, becoming operationalists. There's more organizations who are trying to experiment. A lot of organizations identifying that, oh, we can do things differently, and oh, my industry is changing pretty rapidly, and I do need to start to do things differently. And things like cloud. Cloud has changed meaningfully in Canada. We've got $3.5 billion to spend, and that's just on the cloud services. Right, there's all kinds of other spend related to cloud, but that's just on going off to Azure, AWS, to IBM services, Salesforce, et cetera. What's changing in terms of cloud is infrastructure and platform as a service growing very strongly. In fact, infrastructure as a service next year is going to be over $1 billion market. Right, and you think $1 billion in server and storage in the cloud, well, our spend on server and storage on-prem is about $2 billion, right? So 50% of that spend being in the cloud is a pretty impressive number just in IaaS. Platform as a service as well, which is an indicator of and a key enabler for digital transformation, we see very strong growth happening there. So that's really good news. And big data, lots of experimentation and really interesting things going on there. And that's a world that's changed so fast and in so many different ways. I was just playing around with some basic neural net algorithms, and I had the computer, I had the server environment basically write a bunch of lyrics. So I was like, oh, here, analyze this corpus of lyrics, and then write a song like that. And you're able to do this as kind of an end user and be able to do things like that. Point being that it's getting much easier for us all to be able to start to experiment, and machine learning is going to be a key, and big data is going to be a key component of what we all do in all aspects of our business. There's going to be no part that's untouched. We already see it coming in the tools that IT uses, whether it's security tools and doing analysis, whether it's next-gen endpoint and what have you, and moving away from signature-based, whether it's threat intelligence and that kind of thing. We see all kinds of activity happening from a machine learning standpoint, and that's expanding across the organization. Security is definitely an area that changes. The threat environment doesn't really change, but our attack surface sure is changing. Right, so we're expanding the potential for different vulnerabilities but our investment in security from a national standpoint has increased. We've started to catch up to the US and are investing in some of the advanced solutions and practices, which is really good. So Marshall McLuhan, who you may know from the Medium is the Message, about 50 years ago said this, and it's funny how it still applies today, that yes, we are trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools. And we can see that in our marketplace. So we asked organizations, we aggregated all the different kind of tools across the different life cycle, from a developer, et cetera, standpoint. So everything from Jenkins to OpenShift to Ansible to Chefs, your Puppets and Vagrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found is that about a third of organizations are actually using these tools. Now, I think in this room, you're probably representative of most of those companies, is my guess. And then the rest of Canada isn't doing anything. It's probably how that seems to work out. But what we find is that when an organization starts to do things a little bit differently, and starts to look at their ops a little bit differently, that they wind up investing in a lot of different kind of tools. And by investing, I mean in terms of skill sets. Right? Oftentimes the open source tools themselves are cheap, and a lot of the tools are low cost, no cost. And a lot of times invested in the skill sets that we need to move forward with that. And then so from a DevOps perspective, we've got about 3 in 10 organizations who are saying, yeah, I'm starting to think about the culture of my developers. I'm starting to look at that environment and say, okay, well, what can we do to make your life easier as a developer? What can we do to improve the launching of applications. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then from a Docker or just generally container standpoint, obviously there's far more than Docker. There's Linux containers, et cetera, and Red Hat can talk all about that. We've got about a quarter of organizations who are saying, yes, this is interesting to me. A lot of organizations, when they're saying it's interesting to them, though, are talking a lot about how does it compare to a hypervisor, right? And what is it, what's a Linux container or what have you, what does it mean versus a guest VM in that environment? And so what they're not doing as much as say, okay, well, how is it going to benefit me in terms of being able to have application portability and being able to spin up and spin down this microservice or what have you. So we definitely want to change in terms of how we're looking at containers. And microservices, about 1 in 5 organizations who are involved with that. So I thought this was kind of interesting, just looking kind of over a 5-year view of different search terms, and just basically Google Trends, that's all that is. And you can see significant growth in searches on Ansible, on DevOps, and Kubernetes, and movement in that direction. So it's good. Again, more good news stories than we look at Docker compared to the rest of them. So it's basically taking those same search criteria and just adding Docker, and just you can see how it dwarfs everything else there in terms of search as organizations look at. So it's good news, again, that we see that this kind of activity is happening. And you can see that things like OpenStack, with Nova and Neutron and Heat and Keystone and Horizon, et cetera, kind of went up its curve, and in some industries it's become really paramount to what they do, and other industries are saying, okay, well, I've got other opportunities, I've got different approaches that I can maybe use there. So it's kind of gone over, whether you call it a hype curve or what have you, but the other areas in terms of DevOps still growing very strongly. So again, more good news that we see. So let's start to break this apart even further. So we've got the things that we do from an application design, development standpoint, and things that we can use to start to enhance and change our business models in different ways. And so we think about the notion of the developer, and it's amazing how much that's changing and how quickly what a developer does and how they do it changes. And it's interesting. So a friend of mine, him and his wife, they're foodies. And they watch all the cooking shows, and so they've got all kinds of different recipes that they have, dozens and dozens of them. And so he's like, okay, I got to organize this. So he creates, on his own, he's not a developer, he creates this app. So he's got this app now he can go into, and him and his wife has got this beautiful interface. And you can click on the images. Oh, he's like, I got butter chicken, I'll have cherry bomb chicken, I'll have beef and broccoli. And then he'll set up a calendar for the week. And then from there, it'll say, okay, these are the ingredients that you need. So it'll go out and find the different ingredients from the different recipes for those different meals. And then so, okay, so now I've got my ingredients list for the week. And then what it does further, because he hates spending time in the grocery store, is it'll give him the optimal path for those ingredients. So it'll sort those ingredients and give him the aisles of how he needs to go through the grocery store. And so he did this himself. And so when we talk about the idea of the citizen developer and the end user type of developer emerging, you can see that live happening as individuals are starting to create cool new applications and what have you, and we can start to do that within our own organization. So it's an inspiring time from that perspective as it's becoming much easier. We still need a lot of coders, and we're still going to need coders, and it's not saying that that goes away and that we don't need good Python, Java, C++, et cetera coders. Absolutely we do, and we're going to still need that. In fact, there's going to be increasing demand for that, not decreasing demand as we get further into our world of DX. From a microservice perspective, there's several benefits when we're talking to organizations that they're seeing. So fewer organizations are talking about the benefits in terms of scaling. That, okay, there's times a year when things scale up rapidly. There's a couple on the retailer side that said, okay, that was really interesting for me. But largely it's about being able to do things quicker so I can get what I need a lot more quickly than I was able to before. Or I'm able to de-risk any changes that I want to make to different components of the application. I can make that very easily and not break the entire thing. And so that was another one of the areas that we continue to see when organizations are going deeper into this environment. And it's good to see. So it's kind of like taking the service-oriented architecture model that was kind of a little broken, and taking that and extending it into an environment and into a way of development that now is actually working quite well as organizations move from the idea of monolithic applications to a little bit of more of a microservice approach in componentizing the application stack. Function as a service, we see a pretty early adoption right now, whether it's Azure Functions, whether it's Lambda, whether it's Google Cloud Platform or what have you. But definitely see this on the rise in terms of if I've got, let's say, so I've got some IoT sensors on some machinery and equipment, and I want to be able to say, okay, well, if it's vibrating to this level, it's good, but if it's going to this level, oh, things are bad. So we want to basically have a chain of different services that are going to fire off events that do different things, right, when we hit certain thresholds. So instead of having the infrastructure already dedicated to that occurring, we now build at a 10 millisecond increment. Right, and that's just such a fundamental difference to what we've seen before, and that's really what function as a service starts to get me. And again, we see organizations starting to go down that path and looking at what are the opportunities there. So it's good. DevOps, which is a cultural shift and change within an organization, we do see that, again, as I mentioned, within about 3 in 10 organizations starting to lift off. And I think it's eventually we're not even going to call it DevOps. We're going to call it developers, right? Just doing their thing. And it's just like all of us, we all do a lot more in our daily job that we never had to do before. Eventually it's just going to be, this is how developer teams are formed. That developer teams form around the product rather than the project. And so that, we have the notion of the team writing the code, but also running that code afterwards. Why? Because they can. Because the tools are available for them to be able to write and to run the code. Right? And so we're moving into an era where, again, the whole notion of calling it DevOps will be obsolete, and hopefully that's sooner rather than later. But again, we would like to see that continue to increase, because if we want to decrease that application deployment time, that's a fundamental way that we need to do that. And then, so you add on top of this that we've got our API economy, and really this is an extension of what we have from a microservice architecture standpoint. And we've seen, APIs from a Windows standpoint, Linux. We saw it in a service-oriented architecture, but they were big, heavy APIs back in the SOA days, and they're very cumbersome, WSDL, contracts and what have you. And now it's very simple, RESTful APIs that we've had for about the last decade or so. And that's allowing us to be able to glue together many different types of application. Again, like my friend, being able to stick together a bunch of different types of services and pull that together into a simple mobile interface. So when we think about one area that I'm really excited about is on the machine learning side. And so much change happening here. We're starting to go, we've had the world of the data scientist, which was, the person in the dark room with the cloak and what have you, and the lightning in the background, and that's given way to more of this democratized notion of what data scientist is. I mean, certainly if you have that skill set, you have a leg up on everyone else. If you know the difference between different algorithms and which model to apply to which problem and how to train those algorithms, you're in a better position than others. But the services are getting so much easier and so much better to use. And again, in pretty much everything that we do, we're going to be using machine learning to some extent. So it's important to continue to drive those skills. From an IoT standpoint, lots of activity happening in Canada, whether it's in our manufacturing sector, whether it's in, starting to look at the quantified self from a healthcare perspective. You name it, across the board, we're starting to see a lot of increase. And so being able to connect that into what we're doing, whether it's through a function as a service or whether it's through some other approach, definitely see that growth happening quite strongly. Lots more sensors. We have, we've got a sensor forecast of how many billions of sensors we have in this country, which is always fun to watch that counter go up. And then it's interesting, I was thinking about where all this is coming from, and we talked a little bit about this last year as well, and how we wouldn't have cloud if we didn't have open source, and we wouldn't have big data if we didn't have open source. And I think a lot of that comes down to, and the reason why I bring it up is because it's because of the community approach. It's lots of different individuals coming together to learn. And so when I was talking earlier about the relationship we have with vendors, it's also the relationships we have all with each other, and that we can have conversations. And we're very fortunate to be in the city of Toronto, where we have so many different user groups that meet up, or an event like today, where we all get to have beers later on and chat, and have a lunch to be able to network and chat through as well. But it's being able to have that community development, which is why, and a good reason why open source has been so successful, but again, is how we can all start to be successful as well, and move from being traditionalists to experimentalists to operationalists, and see where the pitfalls are within our like-peer organizations. So bringing this all together then in terms of one chart, we've got what's happening from an application abstraction standpoint. Maybe we want to be abstracted from the infrastructure. Maybe we still want to be able to get right into the infrastructure. We have that capability. Developer services changing quite dramatically as we shift from traditional development approach into a DevOps approach, but that's enabled by a lot of tools that we have either on-prem in a opinionated PaaS type of environment, or ultimately in a broader PaaS type of environment. And then we've got what's happening from a data standpoint, as I mentioned, which is a key component to organizations who are being more successful. How they view their data is absolutely setting them apart. And then we've got a lot of different things we can start to build and extend our capabilities around, whether it's being able to extend through IoT, whether it's starting to think of blockchain in different kinds of ways and what have you, that we see that extension from the basic capabilities that we build out in that API economy allows us to be able to do things a lot more differently than we have in the past and compete with companies that are, booking 450,000 room nights from 0 room nights builds, a few years ago to that number happening. So we are going to be extending from the legacy that we have, right? Traditionalists are traditionalists not because they want to be, but because you've got a lot of legacy. And so we need to be able to extend from what we have. To be able to extend from what we have, we obviously want to be able to look at which workloads do I want to put where and be able to make those kinds of decisions, right? And those are older problems, but a lot of organizations are still going through that, making what's the RTO and RPO on that data? What's the level of security on that data? What's the performance level I require? Do I want to distribute it across multiple different clouds to de-risk it or what have you? So there's a lot of questions that we still need to be able to address in that regard, just to flag that. And when organizations in this country are thinking about hybrid cloud, the top 5 things are security, right? Keep my data confidential, but also shared responsibility. Looking at it from a data residency standpoint, still top of our list. Keep the data close as possible. Self-service, I want to be able to serve it whether I'm in the line of business or wherever I'm from. Workload portability is definitely becoming more important to us. Right? We asked this question even 2 years ago, workload portability. It wasn't really about that. It was about, okay, workload will live here, this workload lives here, that's it, done, end of story. Now it's about, okay, I've got my data here, maybe I want to move it over here. Or maybe I want to move it over here, and thinking through the implications of that, so the ingress and egress charges that I have from the cloud, but also thinking about it in terms of who's going to give me the best cost, what's the, if one is down, can I move that data easily over to another? And then identity management also is an area that really has changed in terms of going higher up on Canadians' list of we want to be able to make sure that users who shouldn't have access to the service don't have access to the service. So we want to provision or deprovision those users. We also want to be able to move credentials around of, we're in a microservice environment. We don't want to be necessarily sharing credentials with one and the other. If it's like kind of sharing your same password with one service and another service, you might not want to do that. So it's being able to, again, use things like OAuth or what have you to be able to, how do I manage through that? So when we asked organizations, what are your top security concerns? Again, shared responsibility is the #1 area that organizations in this country are focused on. So what I did was just made out a quick little chart. I won't walk you through it, just leave it as a takeaway for you. But basically think about things like physical security. Obviously the provider is going to take care of that for me. I don't have to deal with that anymore. But things like incident response, I probably want to switch on log management in AWS or what have you. If an incident happens, I won't be able to investigate it if I haven't turned that on, but only for the workloads where it makes sense. So it's things like that. It's just going through kind of like a checkbox saying, is it my responsibility? Is it the cloud responsibility, cloud provider's responsibility, or is it a shared joint responsibility between the both of us? So just map that out for what that looks like. So as we start to close off, it's the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, remember we used to talk about autonomic computing, so self-healing hardware. So we never really got to self-healing hardware, but we got the tools that allow us to spin things up and down in the software layer very quickly. We abstracted up a layer and got to software-defined data centers, right? And that's helped us to do things in a vastly different kind of way. We talked about utility computing and grid computing and service-oriented architecture and all these different things. And now today, all this is coming to fruition and coming to be a reality where we see this kind of end user usage of machine learning or basically doing some basic development and being able to do things in different ways than we've been able to do it in the past. So again, we measure what organizations are doing successfully and not so successfully. And so when we look in the data center, we've got top areas where organizations focus on is Focusing on my downtime, of course, we don't want servers and storage and et cetera to be down or applications. We focus on things like performance. Of course, everyone wants good performance, and those aren't necessarily the most successful organizations, because those are the ones that are typically doing the firefighting rather than doing the planning. What we find the more successful companies are doing are the ones that are focused on portfolio management, right? Project and portfolio management, which is basically setting the order of priority of which application or which project get done when, based on a given metric, typically ROI. And then also on areas like 10 and 11, which is change, right? Change, being able to do change management in a way that's basically not going to break things. Still a good read. I've recommended this book every year since I've been here, but I still like it. It's 4 or 5 years old, Phoenix Project. Still a good book to read in that regard from a change management standpoint. So those are what successful organizations are doing. What we find is that the IT department needs to do all the things that it did in the past. Right, so those are all still there. So making sure that downtime, performance, all that is taken care of. Trying to refine processes, but then on top of that, now have to help the business identify which part of the business is best suited for digital transformation. Where am I going to start to experiment? Or if I'm already doing things, where can we start to do more within the organization? Where can we start to change things from a cloud plus mobility plus big data plus social plus IoT, and starting to add all these pieces together that are becoming more modular types of pieces. And then we need to identify the technology that's best going to fit under that, right? Which is a role that IT is uniquely suited for. And then finally, it's to project or possibly product manage it, again, depending on what kind of point of view you take there, and work that through for the organization as well. So lots of responsibilities and lots of increased activity that we see happening. So again, it's important to be using everything at our disposal in order to be able to do things faster and better, as again, we're starting to compete against international players that are doing a lot of business in this country. So lots of things for us all to do as things continue to change, and that pace of change that we've talked about every year, again, is not slowing down but only increasing. But again, I think it's just brilliant that we have days like today to be able to come together and to be able to have conversations about what are you doing, well, what are you doing, and what are you guys doing, and we can all kind of have those dialogues and then continue that dialogue afterwards. So again, I really appreciate the invite from Red Hat to come and speak with you today, and thank you guys very much for the time today. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
You're very welcome, Claude. Thank you. Did you guys want to do any quick questions, or do you want to do?
We have a few minutes. We're a little ahead. So does anybody have any questions for David? You're not going to get too many chances to ask someone with this amount of knowledge. So anybody out there? I know I saw a few people interested in getting the slides, so obviously some of you saw some compelling stuff.
We'll definitely send those out, yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. And again,
right there.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Wondering if you see any patterns in the distribution on the left and the right side of the divide on traditional types of businesses, higher education versus finance versus.
Oh yeah, great question. So the question was around, how do we see organizations aligning across traditionalists, experimentalists, operations strategists? Are there certain industries maybe that are a little bit farther ahead than other industries? And we see leading examples. So if you look at strategists, you'll find manufacturers, you'll find retailers, you'll find financial services firms, you'll find certain cities and municipalities that maybe are kind of started getting there. So when we look at overall, those who typically are more technology-centric as an industry tend to be a little bit further ahead. So areas like financial services, so in capital markets, some of the areas of some of the retail banking tend to be a little bit farther ahead than their peers. Certain retailers tend to be a little bit further ahead. And some actually in certain parts of our telecommunications industry tend to be a little bit further ahead in certain regards. And then we've got others who tend to underinvest in technology, which again is on kind of the manufacturing side. Some areas of our public sector and what have you tend to be on that on the other side. But again, you can find examples of every industry across any one of those different areas, traditionalists, experimentalists, operationalists, and strategists at the end of the day. And typically, also just to finish off on answer your question, Typically, it's our some of our mid-market companies you can actually find a little bit further up on that scale in the operationalists, just because they've started to look at their environment and say, oh my gosh, like I'm competing with some of these mega corporations, and they kind of can create a culture a little bit more quickly than maybe some of the larger players can, because a lot of this is about cultural change as much as it's about, you know, the tools that we use or the process that we have or that kind of thing. And so they're in a slightly better position sometimes to be able to make those changes. They have the demands, the fear, and they have some of the ability to make those investments. Yeah.
All right.
Great question.
Any other questions?
Way over here.
Can someone, I'll walk a little bit. I should have grabbed a mic. Go ahead.
Just curious if you're finding with the migration from traditionalists to experimentalists and everything else, if the number of platforms that the company is involved in has a direct correlation to how fast they move to the next level.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is around, you know, as organizations move along that continuum and move up that maturity path, is there a correlation and maybe a negative correlation between the number of different platforms? In other words, have they standardized on certain tools and what have you? It's kind of yes and no. So actually, it's a funny one. So first, you see the number of things actually expand quite a lot. So they're not wedded to one thing, they're trying all kinds of stuff. So they're like, ooh, that was cool. Well, how about that tool, and that tool, and that tool? And so you'll see all kinds of stuff throughout, and you'll see all kinds of platforms distributed throughout the organization. I think to become to that strategist level, though, you do have to then consolidate and standardize. Right? It's very difficult to be able to run on many different platforms and have that multitude and try and integrate across it. Yes, integration is getting easier and we've got more abstraction than we ever have, but you know, if you want to move ultimately from being that operationalist to the strategist, I think you would have to reduce that number.
All right. Question right there.
Smokes, I got a mic. Does it work? Yeah. Wonderful. There was a slide that talked about what different parts of the business thought was important. One about IT and one about the line of business. And the line of business said, I want reliability. And IT said, I need to change faster. So like that was like directly inversely proportional to each other, right? IT wants to change because they keep being asked to change, and they're unreliable because the business keeps asking them to change. So there's a gap there, and I think there's a lot of study that you could do. Do you do any of that study, untangling that?
Yeah, it's a great question about you know, the gap between line of business and how ultimately we narrow it, and what the relationship is between the IT being stretched further and further and further. It's like, well, how can I be reliable if you keep asking me to do all these other things, and if you won't make that investment within my organization? And that would be a whole study unto itself, which could be very interesting to delve deeper and deeper into. Which is, you know, how much time gets dedicated to given tasks, and then what are organizations doing in terms of trying to get less on the keeping the lights on side that everyone talks about towards more of that innovation time, and what are the key differences? I mean, some of the things I was talking about in terms of adopting the tool sets, adopting some of the processes, maybe you know, Googlifying in terms of you know, workload, where, you know, certain time every week is given to, you know, whether it's lunch and learn sessions or what have you, or birds of a feather, where you get together and learn about again, looking at here's our application stack and here's how we could maybe do that differently. Even if we're not going to do it, we're going to start to figure out what it might look like if it was a microservice-based approach, and just consider that as an architecture. Not necessarily that it's going to be the right approach, but just an approach. So it's organizations who can do those different things that are going to be able to start to narrow that gap. But I agree with you that if you're in a culture that doesn't allow for that, it can be quite a challenge to be able to adapt and change when the business is saying, look, I need you to do all these different things for me. And it's also going to be difficult to be able to do the reliability piece if you, again, if you haven't done the adoption of the tool sets and of the processes really that need to happen. But interesting, yeah, you're right. That would be a whole interesting study to delve deeper into.
All right, we'll take one more question if anybody has one right here.
Last, in our organization, most of the applications were run on premises. I'm not, oh, sorry. In the past, in our organization, most of the application I'm from financial sector. So we run on premises. I'm not talking about cloud. I'm talking about application. And now, and since the vendors provide option to run on their premises, so business decided go to the vendor for some of the applications. There is kind of reverse order now. They didn't go too well for some of them, some yes. So what's the trend?
In terms of organizations kind of moving out towards more of this outsourcing towards,
Sorry, it's not outsourcing, it's going to the vendor itself.
yeah, and hosting it.
Yes.
Yeah, no, definitely we see, so the hosting market, application management, continues, it depends on which segment of the market you look at. So in the larger segment, we see that that's happening more so because they want more of the high touch and they want some of those abilities to be able to have that throat to choke or back to pat and that kind of thing. And you kind of get that inherently with some of those arrangements, some of those relationships. Whereas down market, go to public cloud, right? And so we'll see a lot more either infrastructure as a service, and so they're taking their application stack and putting it there, or they're just going right out to Salesforce or to whichever other provider. So it's kind of split between which end of the market, and it's based typically around the budgets that the organization has available and the demands and the risk requirements that they have around that application stack.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David. Are you around for a little bit this morning?
Absolutely I am, yeah. I'm going to join you guys for lunch, and that's going to be fun.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Clive. Cheers.